Brian sat in the back of Mrs. Wilson's math class, secretly working on his science homework as she droned on about something they had already learned. He was constantly glancing at his classmates, making sure no one would catch him. With his short build and mousy brown hair, Brian was not the type of kid to stick out in class. He took advantage of that now. The classroom phone rang. Brian jumped. He calmed down, then looked around to see who had noticed him. He looked at Mrs. Wilson, who was staring directly at him with the phone to her ear. "Oh no," he thought. "Here it comes!" Mrs. Wilson was infamous for screaming at students who didn't pay attention during class. Instead, she said,
"Brian, would you please report to the principal's office?"
Brian stood up. Getting sent out of class was quite unusual for him. He had never done anything wrong, and he didn't think that he had ever been sent to the principal's office. Mrs. Wilson told him to take his belongings and then continued her lesson. Brian took his math and science binder and shoved them into his ratty backpack. As he walked across the classroom, he noticed everyone staring at him. They must have assumed that he had done something wrong. He exited into the hallway and shut the door behind him. Why would I get sent to the principal's office? Brian thought as he walked down the hall. He wasn't a bad kid, and he had never done anything wrong at school. He entered the office and found his dad sitting, looking visibly upset. "Dad, what's wrong?" Brian asked. His dad looked up, and Brian saw that his dad had been crying. "Mom died, Brian," his dad said hesitantly, "in a car crash." He was lying. He had to be lying. So many thoughts reeled in Brian's head. It was too much to process. He had been aware of his mom's alcohol addiction, but his family couldn't afford rehab for her. She had still been a loving mother, but she drank to forget how bad her family's situation was. They lived in the worst part of Morrisville, where crime was common and nobody dared venture into that part of town. Brian was constantly worried and upset about his family and how he would get a job without going to a good college. Brian was smart, but he didn't have a talent that made him stand out. Brian collapsed into a nearby chair and loudly burst into tears. He was used to feeling grief, but not so strongly. His dad put his hand on Brian's shoulder, trying his best to comfort his hurt son. "Come on, Brian. Your school counselor agreed to see us both right now. Let's go." Brian slowly got up and staggered into the counselor's office. It was small, about 10 feet by 10 feet, and was sparsely furnished. He recognized the counselor. She was a blonde woman who he sometimes saw walking down the halls. He had never had a reason to come into the counselor's office.
"Sit down, Brian. My name's Catherine,"
she said, handing him a box of tissues.
"Why don't we start this session off by you two telling me her story?"
Brian's father began, explaining how he met Brian's mother in high school. They fell in love, but neither of them could get into the same college. When they were faced with the prospect of splitting up, they decided to go to a community college. While they were in college, Brian was born, so they both had to quit their education and find immediate jobs to support their son. His mom fell into depression and turned to alcohol. 17 years later, nothing had changed. His dad was still working multiple jobs to support Brian and his mother, who was constantly drinking.
"What do you remember about your mom, Brian?"
Catherine asked.
"It's okay to share some things she did that made you feel uncomfortable and scared."
"She would often come home late at night, but not as late as Dad," Brian said. "On her worst nights, I would have to stop doing work and help her into bed. I started to do that when I was 8.
"I'm sorry you had to go through that at such a young age,"
Catherine said.
"But is there a memory about your mother that you cherish?"
This was hard for Brian to answer. He thought back to when he first brought his best friend from junior high, Reed, over to his house. His mom had promised that she wouldn't drink for that one day so he could pretend he had a normal family. It was the most recent time in his life that his mom had been sober for an entire day. Sometimes she was sober for a couple of hours, but then she would start drinking again. The session continued for another 45 minutes. They spoke about his mother and how she impacted Brian's life. She brought up how his family was going to move forward and how to grieve properly. She wanted to make sure they didn't feel guilt, anger, depression, or loneliness.
Since this session is concluding in a couple of minutes, I wanted to share a good way to grieve that many people find helpful.
Catherine announced.
"Here is a journal for you,"
she said, handing Brian a journal. It was a fancy journal, one that Brian would never be able to afford. The binding was a bright shade of silver, while the front and back were dark blue and covered in patterns of stars.
"I want you to write whatever you feel like writing in your journal. If you ever feel like you need to pour your feelings into something, a journal is a great place to put them,"
she advised.
"I will be here if you ever need any emotional support. Just come in and knock."
They left the room and exited into the hallway. "I think you should come home with me, Bud," Brian's dad said. "But don't you have to work?" Brian responded. "I can just take work off just for today," he said. So they left school. Brian got into his family's beaten-up brown Honda, and they drove off. After a silent 30-minute drive, they pulled up on the gravel driveway and got out of the car. It was a brutally hot day, and there was little shade outside of their small house. His dad rushed to the door. He jammed the key into the lock and entered the house. Brian's dad rushed into his room and closed the door. Brian could tell that his dad was going to act withdrawn for a while, which is how he usually acted when he was upset. Brian walked into his room. It was no bigger than the counselor's office. There was only a bed, a dresser, and a desk. He sat down at his desk and pulled out a journal from his backpack. He thought about what the counselor had said. Brian took out his only pen from his backpack and opened the journal. There were so many things Brian was thinking about, but what should he write? He started with a short sentence. "I miss my mom." That much was true. Even though his mom was an alcoholic, he still loved her with all his heart. He proceeded to write. He wrote about his first good memory of his mother, when he was 3 and she brought him ice cream on his birthday. He then wrote about his first not-so-good memory, the time when his mom had come home drunk one night and she didn't recognize her own son. The more he wrote, the more he realized how much of an influence she had been on his life. As much as he wanted to get into college to support his family, he really wanted to be able to get his mom into a rehab center. He wrote about the dreams he had of the future, where his mom loved him and took care of him, and had a well-paying job. Now those dreams would never come true. He kept on writing, and he lost track of time. He had so many important things to say, and writing them down felt so satisfying, so gratifying. He finally had found a way to reveal his innermost thoughts. He jotted down the first time he realized his mom was an alcoholic. He wrote about when his best friend Reed realized that she was an alcoholic. It wasn't until 8th grade, after they had been friends for over a year. Reed had been the high school basketball star that he was now, and the two were as close as could be. Eventually, Reed put 2 and 2 together and figured it out. That had been one of the scarier moments for Brian. He had been scared of the rejection that might come with having a mother who was alcoholic. But Reed was understanding, and sometimes let Brian crash at his house when his mom was extremely drunk. He decided to write about his worst memory of his mom, when she had passed out on the couch, and he had to call an ambulance. She almost died from alcohol poisoning that night, and Brian had been terrified of it happening ever since. Brian decided to wrap up his thoughts with what he was going to do now that his mom was gone. Satisfied that he was done, he stood up and looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock. He had been writing for over 5 hours. Brian looked down at his journal and realized that he had filled half of the pages with his thoughts. Brian walked out of his room and checked on his dad, who was asleep, taking advantage of being home so early. Brian went to the kitchen, fixed himself a bowl of cereal for dinner, and reflected on how much he had written. Once he finished eating, he finished up his nightly routine. He showered, brushed his teeth, and got into his small pajamas. As he climbed into his creaky bed, he was imagining what Reed would say tomorrow. He lost himself in his thoughts and fell asleep. The next morning, Brian got up and got ready for school. Right before he left for the bus stop, he checked his dad's room. Yup, he was gone to work some random job. When he left, he locked the doors with his keys and started the 15-minute walk. It was only 6:30 in the morning and the sun hadn't fully risen yet. He was on his way to a zero-period class, which barely anyone attended. It was a fun class, and Reed was in it as well. He got to the bus stop and boarded the early bus to his high school. There was only one other person on the bus, who made sure not to make eye contact with Brian. After the 30-minute drive, Brian had only 10 minutes to make his class. He entered the main building on his campus and immediately spotted Reed. With his flaming hot red hair and a 6'9" build, Reed was hard to miss. Brian came over to Reed. "What's up?" Brian said, trying to be as upbeat as possible. Brian found that humor was the best way to cope with his grief at school.
"I heard about your mom, Brian. I'm sorry for your loss."
Reed said.
"It won't help you to hide it from your best friend. If you want to talk, I'm here for you."
"Thanks," Brian said, "but I already found a great thing to talk to."
"You have imaginary friends?"
Reed asked. "Ha, no, I write stuff in a journal," Brian replied. "I wrote a ton last night, and it really helped me." They arrived at the classroom, put their stuff on the desks, and started waiting for the teacher, who was notoriously late for zero-period classes.
"Can I read some of it?"
Reed asked. Seeing the look on Brian's face, he added,
"Come on, dude. We share everything with each other."
"I guess," Brian said, "but you won't have time to read it all." He pulled the journal out of his backpack and handed it to Reed. Reed flipped it open and began to read. Brian waited apprehensively for a reaction. Would Reed judge him for what he wrote?
Wow. This is amazing. This is amazing. How did you write all of this? I could never write this well.
Really, Brian thought. He looked over his writing and saw that it actually flowed like a story. His writing was actually very detailed, and his vocabulary enhanced what he wrote.
We have to show this to Mr. Roberts. You could get this published. You could be famous, dude.
Declared Reed. Speak of the devil, Brian murmured as Mr. Roberts walked in. Mr. Roberts was like the stereotypical male high school English teacher. He was tall, wore button-down shirts, had a gray beard, and drank lots of coffee. Mr. Roberts called attendance and started the class. He gave them instructions for a couple of minutes and then let them do classwork. Reed handed Brian the journal. On the top was a post-it note that read, "Come on, show it to him." Brian wasn't sure. It was great writing, but it was also kind of private. What would his mom want? Would she have wanted to die and never be remembered, or would she want her life to be commemorated? He made his decision and walked over to Mr. Roberts' desk. "Mr. Roberts, can I show you something?" Brian asked.
Sure, Brian. What is it you want to show me?
He responded inquisitively. Brian tentatively handed him the journal.
What is this?
Mr. Roberts asked. "It's a journal," Brian responded, "where I wrote stuff about my mother. She passed away yesterday, and the counselor told me to write in this journal. My friend Reed told me to show this to you."
I'm sorry for your loss, Brian. Give me some time at my desk to read this over, okay?
"Sure," Brian said, and walked back to his desk. Reed gave him a fist bump, and then Brian turned his attention across the room to Mr. Roberts. He watched as Mr. Roberts opened the journal and started reading. Mr. Roberts' eyes widened. Brian saw Mr. Roberts flip the page and continue to read, looking very engrossed in Brian's writing. Brian shifted his attention to his classwork and forgot about Mr. Roberts and his journal. About 10 minutes later, Mr. Roberts got up and walked over to Brian's desk.
Brian, this is amazing. I didn't even read it all, but have never seen such original writing with such dedication in any of my students' work.
Mr. Roberts exclaimed. Brian was shocked. Getting a compliment from Mr. Roberts was like getting an untrained puppy to sit.
With some help, this story could be published.
He elaborated.
Your story flows and is filled with emotion. Come to my desk, let's work on this, and I will see if I can send this to one of my publisher friends to see what we can do.
This was crazy. Brian would have never have thought, under any circumstances, that any of his writing would get published. He had good grades in English class, but he wasn't very confident in his writing skills. They both walked over to Mr. Roberts' writing desk, and Mr. Roberts, who was great at typing, started to type Brian's story. As he typed, they fixed the conventions in grammar and edited some of the wording. There wasn't much to revise, so after 30 minutes, Mr. Roberts said, I believe
we can send this to my friend as a first draft, but you will need to...
There wasn't much to revise, so after 30 minutes, Mr. Roberts said,
I believe we can send this to my friend as a first draft, but you will need to add more writing later.
Okay, Brian replied. He hadn't been expecting so little editing.
But first we need to determine what makes this memoir so special. So I want you to write something short before I send this to him.
Continued Mr. Roberts. Brian sat down at Mr. Roberts' computer and started writing why he thought people would want to read his book. He was a boy struggling in life to support his poor family. After his mom's death, he needed to believe that dreams are achievable. He knew that he had the potential to get into a good college, but he had nothing to capitalize on. His chance to showcase his talent was right before him, so he typed. He wrote about how most readers would identify with him because he didn't feel special. He wrote about how his mom's death brought negative consequences, as well as outcomes that could change his life for the better. He ended his pitch by stating that his memoir showed that for every bad thing that happens to you, an equally good thing will too. The world balances itself out, and hopefully Brian was going to have something good happen to him as well. When they were finished, Mr. Roberts printed the memoir out, put in a thick envelope, and addressed it to his friend. He promised Brian that he would send it to his friend that day.
1 year later,
Brian entered into Mr. Roberts' classroom, as had become a habit over the past year. In order to get the memoir published, they had been working together for many painstaking hours. They had almost quintupled the memoir's length. They had finally turned in their 7th rework of the memoir about a month ago, which the editor agreed to publish. As Brian walked in, he saw that Mr. Roberts was not sitting at his desk as usual. Instead, he stood, waiting for Brian. In his hand he held a package, and next to him many letters.
Brian,
He said.
it is my privilege and honor to give this to you.
Mr. Roberts handed Brian the package, which he immediately opened. As he expected, it was his memoir, his published memoir. The book was made to look just like the journal that Brian had received from the school counselor a year ago, but there were two changes. In silver ink, in the middle of the cover, the word balance was printed, and just below that, in slightly smaller ink, was written by Brian Wolfe. He opened the book, and there were his words and his mother's story. How long has this been published? Brian asked.
About 3 weeks.
Mr. Roberts answered.
Now don't get angry. I was waiting for these to come so I could show them to you together.
He gestured toward the letters. Brian grabbed one and saw that it was from a college. He looked at the rest of them, and they were each from different colleges. Are those? Brian asked.
Scholarships.
Mr. Roberts answered, suddenly emotional.
You did it, Brian. These colleges saw your book and sent them to the contact address. They want you to come to their school to pursue your writing talents.
Brian was in shock. Never in a million years had he ever considered getting a scholarship from any college, let alone so many. He didn't know what to say. Instead, he gave Mr. Roberts a hug and cried. This was the start of a new life for Brian and his dad. From the money that the book gave him, they would be able to move out of their neighborhood, and his dad could get a permanent job.